The council chamber was filled with alien beings from across the galaxy, and they all watched as Jake Morrison stood in the center with his hands locked in glowing chains. He was the leader of Earth's military, and beside him were Linda Hayes and Henry Blake, who both refused to look down even though they had been beaten during their capture. The trial had been going on for weeks, but everyone knew the decision was already made before it even started. The magistrate was a being made of pure energy that floated inside a special suit, and when it spoke, the words came out in every language at once through the translation devices. The voice said that humanity was guilty of expanding too fast and refusing to follow the rules that the Galactic Council had set for all species. Jake knew this was not really about rules, because the real crime was that humans had grown too powerful too quickly, and the older alien races were afraid of what that meant. The magistrate announced the punishment, and the words echoed through the massive chamber. Humanity would be exiled to a planet called Terteranova, which was listed in the galactic records as Planet X-477, and it was rated as a Class 0 Deathworld. All humans everywhere in the galaxy would be taken to this planet within one cycle, and anyone found outside after that time would be killed on sight. Every human colony would be absorbed by other species, and all human technology would be taken away. Linda grabbed Jake's arm hard enough to hurt, and she whispered that Class 0 worlds were death sentences because nothing survived on them for long. Jake already knew this, but he kept his face calm because showing fear would give the council exactly what they wanted. Henry actually laughed at the magistrate and said they thought they were being merciful, but the magistrate just said that extinction was forbidden by galactic law, so exile was the only legal option. Jake spoke up loudly so everyone could hear and said that humanity accepted their mercy and would remember it always. The way he said it made several aliens step back, because they understood the threat hidden in those words. Within days, the transport ships arrived at Earth and every human colony. Giant cargo ships designed to carry supplies, not people, descended from the sky, and humans were given only 2 days to pack whatever they could carry in their arms. Jake found himself packed into transport 7 with 3,000 other humans in a space meant for half that many. They were given basic supplies like emergency food and water pills, and simple tools like shovels and hammers, but nothing electronic or advanced. The council was sending them back to living like primitive humans from thousands of years ago. A young woman named Claire Bennett pushed through the crowd to reach Jake, and she said she had been studying alien biology before the exile. An older military man named Greg Patterson also came forward and said that even though ranks did not matter anymore, they still needed leaders who could organize people. Jake looked around the transport bay and saw fear in most faces, but in some he saw anger and determination. He told Claire to explain what she knew about Class 0 worlds, and she said they were planets where everything tried to kill you, including the plants and the ground itself, and that survey teams with full technology only survived 5% of the time. Greg said quietly that the council was sending them to die without having to do the killing themselves, but Jake disagreed and said the council forgot that humans did not evolve in paradise. Earth itself had been a dangerous place when humans were still living in caves, and humanity survived ice ages and plagues and wars that nearly destroyed everything. He said humans were survivors, and that was what they did best. The journey took 3 weeks, and during that time Jake organized everyone into work groups based on their skills. He identified people who knew farming and building and medicine and fighting. By the time they reached Terteranova, they had a basic plan, but Jake knew that no plan survived contact with reality. The planet appeared on the screens as they got closer, and it was beautiful, in a terrible way, with 3 moons hanging in a purple sky and red oceans that looked like blood. Claire, read the basic data the aliens had given them, and said gravity was stronger than Earth, which would make everything harder. The day was only 19 hours long, and the temperature went from freezing cold to burning hot depending on where you were. The worst part was that every living thing on the planet had evolved to kill and eat other living things. There was no cooperation in nature here, only constant war for survival. The landing was rough because the alien pilots did not care if their passengers were comfortable. They just dropped the pre-built shelters and supplies in a clearing near a river and left without saying anything. 37 ships landed in different places across the planet, and each one carried thousands of humans who had never asked for this fate. Jake's group was in an area labeled Zone 7, where the temperature was already 40 degrees and the air was so wet it was hard to breathe. Within minutes of Stepping off the transport, someone screamed, because a vine had wrapped around his leg and thorns were digging into his flesh, actually drinking his blood. They learned fast that touching plants was deadly and drinking from still water was poison, and going anywhere alone meant you would die. The first night they lost 12 people to things that came out of the darkness. The second night 8 more died. By the end of the first week 300 people were dead and everyone had scars. But humans learned and adapted because that was what they did. Greg organized hunting parties that figured out which animals were just dangerous versus which ones would kill you instantly. Claire studied the ecosystem and found patterns in how things hunted and killed. Jake coordinated building a fortified camp using techniques from ancient Earth civilizations that had survived in hostile places. They built walls from wood and stone and posted guards every night. They named their settlement Hope's End because Jake told everyone gathered around the fire that this was where the council's hope for human extinction would end. 3 months after landing, the settlement had real walls and farms where they grew food using plants they had carefully tested and learned to control. Other groups of survivors found them and the population stopped shrinking and started growing. The death rate was still high, but it was getting better. Jake stood on the wall one evening watching the 3 moons rise when Linda joined him. She had survived her own landing 300 kilometers away and had walked for 6 weeks with 200 people to reach Hope's End. She pointed at a moving light in the sky and said the council was watching through satellites because they wanted to see how long it took for humans to die. Jake said they should give the council a good show and prove what happened when you gave humans nothing except the will to live. Linda smiled in a way that was not kind and said she had been thinking about what would happen after they survived, because they would definitely survive. Jake looked at her and saw the same thought he had been having. He said that someday humanity would remind the galaxy why you should never give your enemy a place to build and time to prepare, and why you should never underestimate humans. The council thought they were exiling humans to the worst place possible, but they did not realize they were creating the best training ground imaginable. Down in the settlement, children born during the exile played in the streets, and they were already stronger and faster than their parents because they were adapting to the heavy gravity. Hunters came back with food, having learned to outthink predators that had evolved for millions of years. Farmers sang while they worked in fields that had been torn from the wilderness through pure determination. The Galactic Council had made their first mistake by taking everything from humanity and expecting it to make them weak. Jake made a silent promise while looking at the stars that humanity would return someday, and when they did, the galaxy would learn that exiling humans to a death world was not mercy at all. 5 years had passed since the exile, and Terteranova did not look like a death sentence anymore, because it looked like home. Jake stood in the central square of Hope's End, which was now a city of 50,000 people, and he was amazed at what desperation and human intelligence had built together. The wooden walls had been replaced with stone harvested from mountains and reinforced with a cement-like material they made from local rocks. Guard towers stood every 100 meters with hunters who could spot dangerous animals from kilometers away. The real miracle was the children, because a girl named Sophie Carter ran past Jake laughing while she chased a ball with 3 other kids. She was 7 years old and born on Terteranova, and she could run faster and jump higher than any adult from Earth. The stronger gravity that had been torture for the first generation was completely normal for the children. They were stronger with denser bones and faster reflexes.
Jake realized they were watching.
The birth of a new kind of human being, Claire, had become the settlement's chief scientist, and she had made discoveries that would have changed everything. About biology, if anyone in the galaxy cared to listen. She found Jake in his office, which was a simple room, carved from local wood that was 3 times harder than oak from Earth. She said he needed to see something important, because they had made a breakthrough with the predator plants that had killed so many people in the early days. Jake followed her to the research center, which was several buildings where scientists did experiments with whatever equipment they could build or salvage. On a table were samples of the vine that had caused so many deaths. Claire placed raw meat near the vine, and instantly it attacked, wrapping around the meat with thorns extended and beginning to feed. Then she placed another piece of meat that had been treated with something special. The vine approached and touched it, but then pulled back like it had been burned. Claire explained that they had found a compound from an insect called the shellback beetle, which nothing else on the planet would eat. The beetle made a chemical that was poison to almost everything in the ecosystem. They had created a synthetic version and made it into a repellent. Now they could make safe zones and push back the dangerous perimeter without constant fighting. Jake said it was incredible, and Claire said that was not even the best part. She led him to another section where Greg Patterson was waiting, and the former soldier had become the security chief. He said they had figured out metallurgy, or rather a 16-year-old kid named Kevin Wright had figured it out. The boy was smarter than any engineer Greg had ever met. They could not make anything complicated, but they could forge real steel, which meant real weapons. He showed Jake a blade that was simple but deadly with an edge that looked extremely sharp. Greg said they had started giving these to hunting parties, and combined with Claire's repellent and the survival techniques they had developed, their expedition survival rate had jumped to 92%. Jake asked how fast they could produce more weapons, and Greg admitted not fast enough because they had raw materials, but the process took a lot of work and time. They needed more trained metalworkers and better forges. Jake said they would make time and train more people because he wanted every adult in the settlement armed within 2 years. The other settlements across Terteranova were doing similar things, and they had established communication through runners who were brave people, making dangerous journeys between population centers. Through these runners, Jake learned that humans had been scattered across 6 continents with different results. Some settlements had failed completely, and everyone died, but others were thriving just like Hope's. And on the northern continent, a settlement called New Haven had discovered geothermal energy and was using it to power basic machines. On the western continent, Ironhold had found rich mineral deposits and was becoming a center for making tools and weapons. Each settlement was specializing based on what they found, and slowly but surely they were connecting into a network. Linda had established herself as leader of Riverside, which was a settlement 300 kilometers south, and she made the journey to Hope's. And with a group of representatives, they met in the council chamber, and Linda spread a hand-drawn map across the table. She said they needed to formalize everything because right now they were 37 separate settlements trying to survive independently. They needed to become one nation with one government and one unified people. A leader named Marcus Cole, who had been a construction foreman before the exile, suggested calling it the Council of Terranova, where every settlement sent representatives to make decisions together and share resources and coordinate defense. Jake added quietly that they also needed to prepare, and the room became silent because everyone knew what he meant. Linda said he was still thinking about going back to the galaxy, and it was not a question. Jake said he thought about it every single day. The council thought they had buried humanity here and could forget about them, but humans remembered Earth and the colonies and everything that had been taken. Someday, somehow, they were going back. Marcus asked with what, because they had swords and stone buildings while the council had ships that could destroy planets. He said he supported hope, but they needed to be realistic. Jake said he was being realistic because they had achieved amazing things in 5 years, starting with nothing. If they had 50 years or 100 years, they could do anything. They were adapting to this world faster than anyone thought possible, and they were not just surviving anymore, but actually growing and learning and getting stronger every day. He walked to the window, overlooking the settlement, and said the council saw Terranova as a Class 0 death world, but humans were starting to see it as a training ground. Every child born here was tougher than the generation before. Every new generation would be more adapted. While they were here getting stronger, the galaxy was forgetting about them, and that was the council's second mistake. A leader named Sarah Brooks asked what the first mistake was. Jake smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had found purpose in suffering. He said the first mistake was thinking that taking everything from humans would make them weak. The council did not understand that humans were most dangerous when they had nothing left to lose. The Council of Terranova was officially formed 3 months later. Runners between settlements became regular trade routes, and knowledge was shared freely. Riverside became a center of farming because of its river location. Ironhold specialized in metalworking. New Haven developed energy systems. Hope's End became the political and military center as the largest settlement. The population grew not just through births, but also by absorbing scattered survivors who were still finding their way to civilization. By the 7th year of exile, the human population had stabilized at around 200,000 and was growing at 5% every year. Jake's office received daily reports carried by runners who had become some of the toughest people on the planet because walking hundreds of kilometers through deadly terrain was their normal job. Jake was reading productivity reports when Claire burst into his office with her face showing excitement or alarm. She said they had a problem or maybe an opportunity, and she could not decide which. She led him to one of the few vehicles they had kept running with fuel made from local plants. They drove for an hour into the wilderness to a place where explorers had been surveying potential expansion sites. What Jake saw made his heart race with fear and excitement at the same time. In a clearing surrounded by the most dangerous predator plants that could kill a human in seconds was a structure. It was not made by humans, and it was not natural. It was a structure of metal and composite materials half buried in the ground, and covered with plants but absolutely unmistakable. Jake asked if it was what he thought, and Claire confirmed it was a ship or what remained of one. She said it was old, extremely old, possibly thousands of years or even tens of thousands of years. It was not from any species they had encountered in the galaxy. They approached carefully with Claire's repellent keeping the worst plants away. Up close, Jake could see the ship had crashed with its hull broken in multiple places. There was writing on it with, symbols nobody could read. Claire said there was more because they had found 3 other crash sites in the last month with different designs and different ages, but all telling the same story. Terteranova was not just a Deathworld, but a graveyard where ships had been coming and failing for a very long time. Jake asked why anyone would come here, and Claire said that was exactly what she wanted to know. She told Jake to think about what this meant, because if they could salvage these sites and reverse engineer the technology even partially, they could skip centuries of normal development. Jake looked at the ancient wreckage, and then back toward Hope's End, hidden beyond the horizon. The Council had exiled humanity to a death world, thinking it was the end and given them no technology or tools or anything except the harshest survival conditions imaginable. What they had actually done was put humans exactly where other civilizations had come to die, surrounded by the wreckage of failed attempts to conquer this world. Jake told Claire to gather every scientist and engineer, and historian and anyone who might help them understand what they were looking at. He said to do this quietly because he did not. 20 years had passed since the exile, and Terteranova had completely transformed from a death sentence into something that looked like a real civilization. The observation satellites that the Galactic Council kept in orbit still sent data back to civilized space. But the analysts who reviewed the footage were beginning to feel worried. The primitive survivors they expected to watch slowly dying were instead building cities and infrastructure, and showing no signs of extinction. Jake Morrison was 52 years old now, with gray hair and a face lined from 20 years of harsh, sun and difficult decisions, but his eyes were still sharp as he stood in the command center of Hope's End. The room hummed with electricity powered by the geothermal grid that now connected 12 major settlements. Maps displayed on screens showed Terteranova in incredible detail that would have impressed any professional cartographer from the old Earth days. Jake asked for reports from the assembled council leaders, and Marcus Cole spoke first. The leader of Ironhold had aged into a silver-bearded man who still looked strong enough to break rocks with his hands. He said industrial production was exceeding all projections because they had functional steam engines and basic electronics, and were 3 months away from testing their first combustion engine. The alien wrecks at Site 3 had contained formulas for an advanced metal alloy that they could not reproduce exactly, but had created something close that was stronger than anything the first generation had access to. Sarah Brooks, who oversaw agricultural development, continued the report. She said food production was completely stable because they had domesticated 19 plant species and 7 animal species. The creatures that tried to eat humans for the first decade were now feeding the population. The total population across all settlements was at 430,000, with a growth rate of 8% annually. Most importantly, infant mortality had dropped to only 3% because Terteranova-born children had a 97% survival rate. Jake asked how the children compared physically to the first generation, and Claire answered because she had become the settlement's expert on human adaptation. She said the new generation was superior in nearly every way that could be measured. Bone density was 40% higher, and muscle mass was significantly increased, and reflexes were much faster. The stronger gravity had forced adaptations nobody could have predicted, and it was accelerating with each new generation. Children born in the last 5 years were outperforming their older siblings in every test. Linda said quietly that humans were evolving because the council had exiled them to a death world, and they were adapting to it and becoming something new. A man named Daniel Murphy, who had organized Terteranova's education system, added that it was not just physical changes. The children were growing up learning advanced concepts because that was what they needed to survive. By age 10, they could identify 300 different predator species just by sound alone. They could navigate using the stars and make critical decisions under pressure that would freeze adults from Earth. Terteranova was not just making humans stronger, but also smarter and faster and better at everything. Jake absorbed all this information, feeling the weight of both responsibility and possibility. He asked Kevin about the project, and Kevin Wright, who had figured out metallurgy at 16, was now 31 and serving as chief engineer. He said with barely contained excitement that they were close, really close. The wreck at Site 7 had contained what appeared to be a power generation system, and they had been able to replicate about 60% of its function. Combined with knowledge from the other sites, he thought they could actually do it. Marcus, who had not been briefed on the full scope of the project, asked what exactly they could do. Jake and Kevin exchanged glances because this was the moment to reveal everything. Jake said they were going to build a ship not capable of reaching orbit yet, but capable of atmospheric flight with engines and power. It would be the first step toward getting off this planet and back to the stars. The room erupted in excited conversation, and Jake let it continue for a moment before raising his hand for silence. He said it would take time and resources, with every settlement contributing, and it would be dangerous because they were attempting something with salvaged alien technology that they only partially understood. But if they succeeded, it would prove they could do more than just survive, because it would prove they could advance and develop and eventually leave this world. Linda asked how long it would take, and Kevin said 5 years to a working prototype and maybe 10 years to something that could actually carry people safely. Marcus said they needed to talk about what came after, because even if they could build a ship and reach orbit, they still did not have the technology to build a proper spacecraft that could compete with the Council's fleet. Jake agreed and said not yet, but they would eventually. He said the Council did not know something important that they had found in the ruins, which was bigger than any technology. He pulled up an image on the main display showing alien writing from one of the oldest crash sites. He said Claire's team had been working on translating it for 3 years, and they had finally succeeded. What it said changed everything about their understanding of Terteranova. Claire stood up and took over the presentation. She said the civilization that crashed here called themselves the Thalmor, and according to their records, they came to Terteranova deliberately, not to colonize it, but to study it, because Terteranova was not a natural Class 0 death world. Everyone's attention was completely focused now, and Sarah asked what she meant by not natural. Claire said she meant it was engineered deliberately by a civilization that existed millions of years ago, a civilization that apparently created the most dangerous possible environments for some unknown purpose. She pulled up more data and said the Thalmor were trying to understand why anyone would create a world like this, and they had developed a theory. They believed Terteranova was a testing ground where the ancient builders would challenge themselves and push their limits and force adaptation. Jake said the Thalmor were right because Terteranova was a crucible designed to forge survivors into something stronger. The Council did not exile humanity to a random death world, but to a world that was created specifically to transform whatever managed to survive on it. Marcus said slowly that humans were surviving and not just adapting, but being molded and shaped exactly as this planet was designed to do. Linda continued the thought and said that meant every day spent on Terteranova made humanity more dangerous. The Council thought they were watching humans die slowly, but they were actually watching humans become the one thing the Council should fear most, which was a civilization forged in the worst environment imaginable and coming out stronger on the other side. Jake nodded and said in the old days there was a saying that what does not kill you makes you stronger. Terteranova was trying very hard to kill humanity, and it was making them much stronger as a result. Kevin said that was their advantage and why they would eventually win, but even with everything they were learning, they were still decades away from space travel and generations away from military equality with the Council. He asked how they would bridge that gap. Jake replied one step at a time, because first they would build the atmospheric craft and prove they were not staying down. Second, they would keep growing and learning and adapting. Third, they would start thinking long-term, not in years but in decades or even centuries if necessary. He looked around the room at the assembled leaders and said, Most of them would not live to see humanity return to the stars, but their children would, or their grandchildren would. When that day came, those future humans would be better prepared than anyone had ever been, because they would not just be the species that survived a Deathworld, but the species that conquered it. The vote was unanimous that every settlement would contribute to the ship project, and resources would be pooled, and knowledge shared freely. Terranova's scattered human populations would work as one toward proving that exile was not the end of humanity's story, but just a new chapter. 5 years later, on a clear day with all 3 moons visible in the purple sky, the first human-built aircraft since the Exile took flight. It was crewed by galactic standards and built from salvaged alien alloys and human ingenuity, and powered by a hybrid engine that combined fossil fuels with partially understood alien energy systems. It flew for 6 minutes before landing safely in a prepared field outside Hope's End. Sophie Carter, who had been 7 when Jake first noticed how different the Terranova generation was, now piloted the craft. She was 27 years old and a brilliant engineer in her own right, and she emerged from the cockpit with tears streaming down her face. She said to the assembled crowd that they did it, and they actually did it. The celebration lasted 3 days, but Jake did not join in for long because he stood on the walls of Hope's End looking up at the stars, knowing that somewhere up there, the Council's satellites had recorded everything. He thought to himself that the Council should see everything and know what was coming and understand their mistake. They took everything from humanity and expected them to die quietly, but instead gave them purpose and unity and time to become strong. When humanity returned to the stars, and they definitely... The magistrate who had sentenced humanity to exile 35 years ago stood in the Council observation chamber, watching data streams from Terranova, with growing concern. The energy being that made up the magistrate's form pulsed with colors that indicated confusion and something that might have been anxiety. It said to the assembled committee of observers that this was not possible because Class 0 Deathworlds had a survival ceiling and no civilization had ever exceeded 10,000 individuals on such a world without advanced technology, but the humans had nearly 1 million, a Vortan analyst corrected the magistrate and said current population estimates put humanity at 870,000 with projections showing they would exceed 1 million within 3 years. The analyst said population was not even the most concerning part, and shifted the display to show aerial footage from the orbital satellites. Where there had been nothing but wilderness 35 years ago, there were now cities that were crude by galactic standards, but undeniably real cities. Stone and metal buildings were arranged in logical grids with roads connecting settlements and fields, where deadly predator plants had been cleared and replaced with organized agriculture. Most disturbing were factories producing smoke from what appeared to be industrial processes, a representative from the Kryn species said with disbelief that the humans had electricity, and it was primitive but functional. It pointed to a structure on the screen that was clearly a dam generating hydroelectric power. It asked how this was possible because the Council had given humanity nothing and no technology and no tools beyond basic implements. The Vortan analyst said yet humans had reached an industrial age in 3 decades, which should be impossible because even accelerated development curves did not predict this rate of advancement, especially on a Class 0 world where simply surviving should consume all available resources. The magistrate focused on a particular piece of footage, showing something that made its energy form flicker with alarm. It asked if that was an aircraft, and the analyst confirmed there were actually multiple aircraft. They had observed 7 distinct models over the past 10 years, starting with simple gliders, then moving to powered flight, and the current generation appeared to use some kind of hybrid propulsion system. They were not reaching orbital velocities yet, but the trajectory was clear that humans were aiming for space. Plick's delegate said this was insane because humans were exiled with nothing, and 0 technological base and 0 infrastructure. They should still be in a survival phase, not building aircraft. It asked what they were missing. The Vortan analyst pulled up another data stream and said they believed humans had found the wrecks. Silence fell in the chamber because every species present knew what that meant. Terranova had been classified as a Class 0 Deathworld for over 50,000 years, and in that time, various civilizations had attempted to explore or colonize or exploit it, and all had failed. The planet was covered with the remains of those failed attempts. The magistrate said slowly that this included the Thalmor expedition and the Corvin survey team, and asked how many crashed. vessels were on that planet. The analyst said 11 confirmed sites and possibly more that had not been catalogued. It appeared humans had found at least 8 of them, and were excavating and studying and learning from technology that was thousands of years old. The Kryn representative protested that this was reverse engineering, which was explicitly forbidden under the Exile protocols because humans were not supposed to have access to any advanced technology. The magistrate corrected the statement and said the protocols forbid the council from providing technology but said nothing about what humans might find on the planet itself. It was a loophole but a legal one. The Vortan analyst continued the presentation and said they had been monitoring human communications as best they could. Humans had developed radio technology in the past 15 years, and most of it was local coordination, but they had intercepted some interesting transmissions. It played an audio file that had been translated into Galactic Common. The transmission was between 2 human settlements coordinating technology development. One voice identified as Hope's End Control spoke to Ironhold about completing wind tunnel tests on a new wing design. A person named Sophie said they could increase lift efficiency by another 20% and were sending data. The Ironhold response said Kevin's team was already working on modifications and would have prototypes ready for test pilots within 6 weeks. Hope's End asked about a mapping project, and Ironhold reported they had 80% of the northern continent charted and had found another wreck site that looked promising with coordinates being sent to research teams. The transmission ended and the council chamber remained silent for a long moment. The Plix delegate said humans were coordinating across entire continents and sharing technology and resources, and that level of organization should not be possible for a recently exiled population. The magistrate noted that humans were organized before the exile because humanity had one of the most structured military and government systems the council had encountered. They should have anticipated humans would maintain that structure. The Kryn representative insisted this made no sense because this was a Class 0 death world, with 90% of the organisms actively trying to kill everything else. Humans should be in survival mode, not running research programs and test flights. The Vortan analyst pulled up biological data and said that was another concern. They had been analyzing visual records of the human population, and the first generation showed expected signs of stress and adaptation to the higher gravity. But the analyst told them to look at the second generation. Images appeared of Terteranova-born humans who were taller and more muscular and bone. Density scans taken from remote sensing suggested they were significantly more robust than baseline humans. The Kryn said evolution did not work that fast, and the analyst played an intercepted recording of Claire, who was identified as one of humanity's chief scientists. Her voice explained that Terteranova was forcing rapid adaptation because the humans who survived to reproduce were the strongest and fastest and smartest, and their children inherited those traits. This was not normal evolution but accelerated selection in the harshest environment imaginable. The magistrate asked who that was, and the analyst said it was Dr. Claire Bennett, and she had been documenting humanity's adaptation process. They had intercepted dozens of her research papers, and the magistrate should read them because they were terrifying. The analyst pulled up a document and translated it for the council. It was an observation report from year 35, stating that third-generation Terteranova humans showed remarkable advancement over first-generation baseline. Average height had increased by 8 centimeters, and muscle density had increased by 35%, and reflex speed had improved by 40%. Most significantly, cognitive development appeared enhanced because third-generation children demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceeded first-generation adults. The hypothesis was that Terranova's extreme danger was selecting for intelligence and adaptability at unprecedented rates, and they were witnessing human evolution accelerated by a factor of at least 100 compared to Earth historical norms. The Plix delegate said softly that humans knew what was happening to them and understood they were changing and were documenting it. The Vortan said it was more than that because humans were embracing it. The analyst played another transmission from 15 years ago where Linda's voice said the council thought they buried humanity to die, but humans were not dying but becoming something new and stronger, and when they were ready they were going back. Jake's voice responded that he knew, and that was exactly what he was counting on. The magistrate's energy form flickered rapidly, which was a sign of intense thought. It asked for long-term projections, stating that if humans continued their current development trajectory, when would they achieve spaceflight capability? The Vortan worked the controls and said conservative estimates put orbital capability at year 55 from exile, which was 20 years from now. Actual spacecraft construction, assuming they maintained their learning curve from the wreck sites, could occur as early as year 75. Full military parity with Council. Technology was harder to predict, but somewhere between year 100 and 150, the magistrate said that was 3 to 4 generations, which in human terms was within living memory of the exile. Many of humanity's current children would live to see their species return to space. The Kryn representative said firmly they needed to revisit the exile sentence because this was not proceeding as intended. Humans were supposed to die out or at least be reduced to a primitive state that would take millennia to recover from, but instead they were industrializing and thriving, and based on intercepted communications were preparing for revenge. The magistrate said the exile sentence was permanent and they could not simply reverse it because that would require a full council vote and admission that their original judgment was flawed. The Plix delegate said with agitation that their original judgment was flawed because they thought they were being merciful and thought they were removing a threat while adhering to galactic law against genocide. What they actually did was the diplomatic ship descended through Terranova's atmosphere 50 years after the exile began, and what the crew saw made the mission commander feel both awe and dread in his dual hearts. Commander Vex of the Vortan Stellar Navy had volunteered for this mission, knowing it was dangerous because making first contact with an exiled species that had every reason to hate the Council was not safe duty. Nothing had prepared him for what he was witnessing, as the city below was not primitive but thriving. Hope's End had transformed into a sprawling metropolis of 500,000 people with buildings reaching 20 stories high and streets lined with electric lights and what appeared to be a network of railways connecting it to other settlements. As the ship descended toward the designated landing zone, Vex watched people going about their daily lives with an efficiency that spoke of established civilization. His science officer said with nervous energy that she was reading electromagnetic signatures consistent with widespread electrical infrastructure and radio communications on dozens of bands and industrial facilities. They had a power grid or multiple grids actually spanning entire continents. Vex asked how advanced the technology was, and she said, early to mid-20th century by Earth historical standards, but advancing rapidly. She said humans had accomplished in 50 years what took most species centuries, and that was on a Class 0 Deathworld where they started with nothing. The ship landed in a cleared field outside the city, and Vex had been prepared for a tense welcome that might be hostile. What he was not prepared for was the delegation waiting for them, which consisted of 20 humans standing in organized formation dressed in formal attire made from local materials but styled with military precision. Their head stood a woman who could not have been more than 30 years old, but who carried herself with an authority that made Vex's instincts scream warnings. She was tall at easily 2 meters with the dense muscular build that characterized Terranova-born humans. Her eyes were sharp and calculating as she watched the Vortan crew emerge from their ship. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the field, and she welcomed them to Terranova and introduced herself as Sophie Carter, who was Prime Minister of the Terran Union. She said they had been expecting this visit. Vex's translator relayed the words, and he noted that she spoke in perfect Galactic Common, which should have been impossible. They had been exiled with no translation technology and no linguistic databases. Vex said she spoke their language, and Sophie smiled in a way that seemed predatory. She said they had 50 years to study transmissions from the Council's observation satellites, and had learned a lot more than just language. She invited them into Hope's End, where accommodations had been prepared because she was sure they had many questions. The man beside Sophie added that they also had questions, and Vex recognized him from intelligence files as Kevin Wright, who was now in his 50s, but still impressive and serving as the Terran Union's chief engineer. He said they were very curious about what finally prompted the Council to send a delegation after half a century of silence. The Vortans were escorted into the city, and what they saw defied every expectation because streets were clean and organized, and buildings showed sophisticated construction techniques. People were healthy and well-fed and purposeful, and children played in parks where deadly predator plants had once dominated. This was not a population barely surviving, but a civilization establishing itself. In the government complex, Vex met the rest of Terranova's leadership, where Sophie sat at the head of a long table made from local wood polished to a mirror shine. Around her sat representatives from every major settlement, including Marcus Cole, who was elderly, but still imposing, representing Ironhold, and Sarah Brooks, who spoke for the agricultural collectives. In a place of obvious respect sat three elders who were Jake Morrison now, 77 years old but with eyes still burning with purpose, and Linda Hayes, who had aged into a silver-haired statesman, and Claire Bennett, whose scientific work had documented every step of humanity's adaptation. Few said she would make this simple, because they knew why the council was here. The council finally noticed humans were not dying out, and they were worried, and they should be worried. Vex said carefully that the council was concerned about potential violations of the exile terms because humans were sentenced to Terra-Nova with no technology, yet they observed electrical systems and industrial facilities and aircraft. Sophie said flatly that humans built those things with their own hands and minds, and the exile term said the council would not provide technology, but did not prohibit humans from developing it themselves, unless the council wanted to argue that humans were not allowed to progress. Beyond stone tools, everything they saw was legal. Vex pressed the issue and asked about the wreck sites, because humans had been salvaging alien technology. Kevin interjected that they had been learning from abandoned wreckage on a planet where they were dumped, and the technology belonged to extinct civilizations who died there tens of thousands of years ago. By galactic salvage law that made it theirs, and he told Vex to check the legal codes because they had. Vex felt a sinking sensation because the council had prepared for human defiance and development and advancement, but had not prepared for humans to understand galactic law better than the delegation itself. Vex said the council wished to open negotiations, but Jake Morrison spoke for the first time in an old voice that still commanded attention. He asked what negotiations were about, and whether it was about humans being allowed to exist or being permitted to advance or being expected to feel grateful for exile instead of extermination. Vex started to respond, but Jake interrupted and said he was not an admiral anymore, at least not by council recognition, but he was a witness. He watched the council sentence humanity to death with pretty words about mercy and law, and watched 12,000 people die in the first year because the council put them on the deadliest world in known space with nothing but hand tools. He watched children born in exile grow up knowing they would never see the stars because the council decided humans were inconvenient. Jake stood and moved to the window, overlooking Hope's End. He said the council did not watch humans adapt or learn or forge a civilization from nothing in conditions that should have killed everyone. The council just observed from orbit and assumed humanity would eventually fade away. Vex tried to say the council deeply regretted the situation, but Linda interrupted and said the council regretted nothing. She said they should be honest because the council was here because humans had become a problem. The council's analysts finally noticed humans were not primitives huddling in caves, but a civilization approaching industrial maturity and doing it faster than should be possible. The council was worried about what happened when humans reached space, and they should be worried. Vex said the council was prepared to offer Terranova limited status within the galactic community with trade agreements and cultural exchange and supervised technological development. It was a path back to the stars that benefited everyone. Sophie asked how generous that was with a tone that made clear it was not generous at all. She asked if the offer included returning stolen colonies or compensation for millions of displaced humans, or acknowledgement that the exile was unjust, or reparations for 50 years of forced isolation. Vex said those matters would need to be negotiated, but Sophie said flatly they would not be negotiated because the Terran Union had no interest in council membership, whether limited or otherwise. They had no interest in supervised development and no interest in any relationship with the galactic community that was not based on complete equality and mutual respect. Claire pulled up data on screens showing population growth, curves over 50 years, and industrial output and technological advancement rates, and projected timelines for achieving orbital capability and spacecraft construction, and eventually military parity with council forces. The graphs showed exactly what Vex feared because humanity's development curve was exponential, not linear. Vex asked if they were threatening the council, and Sophie said no, they were promising. In 20 years, humans would have ships in orbit, and in 40 years they would have a fleet, and in 60 years they would have the capability to defend their interests anywhere in the galaxy. Not because they wanted to be aggressive, but because the council taught them they could not trust anyone else to protect them. Asked, cutting through the posturing, what humans actually wanted and why they agreed to this meeting if not to negotiate. Jake returned to the table and said they wanted the council to take a message back. He told Vex to tell the council exactly what they created here by taking humanity, which was the species that crawled out of caves and touched the stars in 10,000 years and exiling them to the worst environment imaginable. He said to tell the council that humans survived and thrived, and every human child born on this world was stronger and faster and smarter than their parents because Terteranova did not tolerate weakness. Linda continued and said to tell the council they gave humanity 50 years of unity with no wars between human factions and no political divisions. Every human on this planet understood they were one people with one enemy, which was the galaxy that tried to erase them. That was a unity no human civilization